Good evening, church. I want to begin with a question. What do you spend your time on? When you think about your week, where does all your time go? What gets the attention regarding your time? It's astounding for us to think about how much time we have. There are 525,600 minutes a year. That's a lot of time. A lot of time to get things done, isn't it? And yet it can be depressing how we spend those minutes. If we ever do an inventory of our time and see what's grabbing the attention of our time and where do we spend our time, it can be a little distressing how we spend our time. USA Today did a survey about time and the top things that people procrastinate the most on. We have all this time, and yet their study found out the top things we procrastinate the most about are, number one, house chores and yard work. Number two, filing our income tax, which we just had to do. Making dentist and doctor's appointments. And I'm like Chris shared this morning, I've got a tooth that I broke, but I don't want to go see a dentist because I know they're going to poke around on the other teeth. Calling our relatives and then changing the oil in our vehicles. We procrastinate about those things. We often procrastinate and delay about the things that are most important for us. Recently, I went to my doctor and she said I needed to lose about 40 pounds. I'm at 250 right now, and she said there's an easy way to do that: diet and exercise. And I imagine if I was asked tonight as far as how important is diet and exercise, many of you would say, yeah, that's important. Yet, if I was to ask how many of you are sticking to your diet and exercise, that would be a whole different story, because we just struggle with that, because it takes commitment. It's a decision that we have to make. It's a commitment that we have to make. And so we procrastinate about those things. Tonight I want to talk about the most important thing that we can do to spend our time on, and yet we procrastinate about it, as far as many procrastinate about it, and that's getting ready to meet our Maker. Open your Bibles, if you have them, to Matthew chapter 25. We're going to look at the parable in Matthew chapter 25 that Jesus told. It's a parable to encourage us to be ready to meet our Maker. It's a story that he told us to encourage us to use our time in such a way that we would accomplish the most essential thing in our life. And in Matthew chapter 25, he's going to teach us how to be prepared to meet our Maker. And tonight, actually, there's one point to tonight's sermon, and that's simply this: if we're wise, we will be prepared for the Lord's return. It's wise to be prepared for the Lord's return. Let's look at this parable in chapter 25 and verse 1. He says, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom." The virgins are like modern day bridegrooms, as far as in Jesus' time, they had the custom that they would accompany the bridegroom to his house, where they would then have this wedding ceremony. And of course, several parables in Matthew, Jesus draws on this imagery of wedding. And he's describing here the kingdom of heaven, and he said the kingdom of heaven will be comparable. In other words, he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, and it will be like this in the future. And of course, many translations identify this, rightly so, as 10 virgins. And they're virgins, but these are young single girls who are involved in a wedding ceremony or procession. In essence, today I think we would probably call them bridesmaids. And they're looking forward to the coming of the bridegroom because they are going to participate in this wedding, and they're excited about that. You notice here, if you glance over this section, that the bride is never mentioned. The bride is never mentioned in this story. And that's okay. We don't need to know about the bride. The strength of the parable doesn't depend on the bride at all. The parable of the bridegroom is the central figure here with the bridesmaids. And therefore, that's where we focus our attention. In verse 1, there are 10 virgin bridesmaids who are looking forward to the bridegroom, who, according to Jewish custom, would leave the bride's house in a great procession towards his own home, and that would be the final part of the wedding ceremony then, where they would hold the wedding ceremony and the festivities that would be conducted. And these 10 virgins had their lamps with them because at the right time the lamps would become then the light, or the torches that would provide that light for them to be able to make their way from the one home to the other. And so they go out and they meet the bridegroom, and they're ready for that. Notice verse 2, it says, the 5 of the virgins were foolish, and 5 were prudent or wise. 5 were foolish, and 5 were wise. Question: what does that mean? What does that mean? What is the foolish, and what is the wise or the wisdom? Generally in the Bible, when we think about those two terms, as far as wisdom and foolishness, it has little to do with knowledge or intellect or book knowledge or the lack thereof. When the Bible talks about those who have wisdom and the foolish or foolishness, it has everything to do with an action. In other words, the foolish people are those who know what to do and they don't do it. And the wise people are those who know what to do and they actually do it. So here in Jesus' parable, he says we have 5 of each. There were 5 foolish bridesmaids. There were 5 wise bridesmaids. There were 5 foolish bridesmaids who knew what to do and they didn't do it. And there were 5 wise bridesmaids or virgins who knew what to do and they actually did it. Look at verse 3. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. Have you ever thought about that? How foolish is that? That's a foolish thing to do. Everyone knows that a lamp would need oil. In fact, we don't even use lamps like that today, but we would know that it would require oil. It would be like me having a flashlight and trying to get around with a flashlight, and yet I would have no batteries in it. And it would be useless. But that's what they had done. Or it'd be like me getting in my car and never putting gas in it and thinking that it's going to continue to go even though it doesn't have gas in the tank. So these foolish virgins, bridesmaids, didn't take their task seriously. They didn't plan ahead with appropriate action. They only made a partial preparation. They knew that they needed oil, but they didn't bring any oil. They knew what they needed to do, but they didn't actually do it. And because of that, Jesus says they are fools. Verse 4, but the prudent, the wise, took oil in flask along with their lamps. The wise girls, in other words, planned ahead. They were prepared. They knew that their torches needed oil, and so they got some oil, and they had a flask of oil with their lamps. They were wise. Now, while the bridegroom was delaying, the bridesmaids or the virgin, all of them got drowsy and began to sleep. Verse 5. Notice all 10 of these girls went to sleep. In fact, if you look at this parable so far, you will notice that the 10 virgins or the bridesmaids are very similar in respect, aren't they? Think about it. All 10 intended to meet the bridegroom. All 10 brought their lamps. All 10 looked forward to taking part of this procession. They thought they were part of the wedding party, and they looked forward to that with eagerness. Verse 5, they all fell asleep when the groom was delayed. So there's many similarities between these two. In verse 7, and we'll get there in just a moment, they all wake up, they prepare their lamps. When the groom eventually comes, they're ready, and we'll observe that later. 10 virgins, 10 bridesmaids are very similar in respect. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us why the bridegroom is delayed. But that doesn't really matter, does it? It's the prerogative of the bridegroom. It's their wedding, the bridegroom and the bride. The wedding was to be on their timeline, and everyone knew that. Everyone else was expected to work their schedules around that big day, and the same is true here. One thing is true, though. With all this extra time, the unprepared virgins had time and opportunity to get ready, but they didn't. They came with no oil, but they didn't remedy that solution at all. Verse 6 says, but at midnight there was a shout, and behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him. There was no warning. It just, all of a sudden, he comes, and there's this call for the action, and all of the bridesmaids were expected to do their duty. In verse 7 it says, then all of those virgins, the bridesmaids, rose and they trimmed their lamps. They spring into action. They make ready to do this procession. Even the ones who didn't have enough oil, as far as they trimmed their lamps and they were ready, the foolish ones. The unprepared ones were just as excited at that moment. They were thrilled at the time that finally the bridegroom had come, and they wanted to be involved in the ceremony. And so they jumped to their feet. But then in Jesus' parable, notice in verse 8, he says, the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. And it's only after they've wasted all of that time, they wasted the opportunity, that the foolish virgins even think that there's a problem. We don't have enough oil. They knew they needed oil at the beginning of the day, but they didn't bother to bring any with them. So now they're desperately trying to get oil from those who had made the proper preparation. Pause for just a moment, because there's a point of clarification. It's not that the foolish girls started out with enough oil and that the bridegroom's delayed caused them to run out of oil. That's not the point of this parable. The point of the story is that they didn't have enough oil in the first place, that they were unprepared. They should have been ready for the bridegroom, no matter whether or not he'd been delayed or not, and yet they weren't, because they were unprepared. So in verse 9, it says, but the wise girls answered, no, there'll be not enough for us and for you too. Go instead to the dealer and buy some for yourself. What's your thoughts there? Are they just being mean girls to deny these others? No, they're being strong here. They're like, no, this is our oil, and you failed to prepare. You need to get your own. And their answer can kind of seem mean at first. Why wouldn't they just share their oil? But you know what? The wise bridesmaids are not being mean. They're looking out for the bridegroom who's depending upon them. This is not a selfish act that they're doing, but they realize that they've got to have enough oil for themselves to be able to get the bridegroom from the one house to the other. And this is the further evidence of the wisdom of these 5 bridesmaids or virgins who had the bridegroom's interests in their minds. They're looking out for him. They know if they were to share, there wouldn't be enough oil, and the whole ceremony would not be able to take place. So they tell the unprepared ones, go and buy your own oil. Now that's really interesting because it's late, and it'd be like me waking up tonight about 2 a.m. and thinking, man, I really like a In-N-Out burger, and drive up to this In-N-Out, go into the drive-thru, and it's like, can I get a double-double with fries and a Coke? It's not going to happen, as far as in this case, there's not even going to be a place for them to find oil. Verse 10 says, and while they were gone away to make their purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him into the wedding feast, and the door was shut. And the word used here indicates that the door was shut to stay shut. And only the prepared virgins were allowed to enter. Only those who were found ready were allowed to enter in. And the unprepared girls who didn't have that foresight, didn't show any real concern about the need of the bridegroom, they were shut out of the wedding forever. Now, of course, they're going to protest. And this is sad because they felt like they should have been included. They believed that they had qualified to enter in, and so they want to argue that. Look at verse 11. Later, the other bridesmaid also came, saying, Lord, Lord, open up for us. See, they're pleading with the groom for the entry. And it's interesting that they identify him, Lord, Lord, in Jesus' parable, which is a way to tell us that they understood that he was in control. They knew that it was him who fully ruled the situation. They knew that their lives were in the control of the bridegroom, and so they address him, Lord, Lord. Verse 12. But he answered, truly, I say to you, I do not know you. I do not know you. What a shock. What a shock. The Lord is saying in his parable, no, you're not going to get in. It's not going to happen. And it's reminiscent of Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, where Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he or she that does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. And he goes on to say in verse 22 and 23 of Matthew chapter 7, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. It's clear on that final day that there's going to be many people that will say, Lord, Lord, who think they're heading in the right direction, who think that they deserve to enter into the kingdom of heaven, who are going to be shocked to hear the words of Jesus that he doesn't recognize them at all. And that's what he's saying here. Despite all of their good deeds, despite all of their religious action, despite all of their partial preparation, and their supposed Christian service, Jesus only sees them as people who practice what? Lawlessness. Lawlessness. And I think that's a good warning to people today. He's saying, no, you're lawless. And that's final. That's the final call. See, in that phrase there in verse 12 where he says, truly I say to you, it carries this force of a judicial verdict. The bastard's not going to change his mind. That once it's decided, there's no opportunity for us to make an appeal. There's no second chances. And he says to them, I do not know you. Which, have you ever thought about that statement? I don't know you. It's not so much a literal statement of non-acquaintance, but rather it's a statement of disassociation. The Lord disassociates with the foolish virgins because they never got themselves ready for his arrival. Oh, they wanted to be at the wedding. They wanted to be part of the wedding party. They counted themselves within that group of bridesmaids. They probably enjoyed great friendship with the bride and the other bridesmaids. They thought they knew the groom. They really believed that they should get in, but they didn't bother to take his arrival serious enough to be prepared. And that's what he wants us to see in this parable. And Jesus said that he will say to them, I don't even know you. I don't know you. It's a moment of sheer terror as the 5 unprepared virgins realize the folly of their action. They should have been ready, but they weren't. And then comes verse 13, if you'll let your eyes fall on that, where Jesus says, be on the alert, for you do not know the day or the hour. In other words, Jesus saying, if you're wise tonight, you'll be prepared. You'll be prepared. You'll know that the Lord is coming back. So regardless of what's happening, and I'm the worst at it. In fact, we were talking about this at lunch. I can get distracted by what's happening today. As far as all of this stuff that's happening in our world, which is backed by Satan. As far as if you look at what's going on in our culture, our government, our country, our world, Satan is taking control as he is the controller of this world. But God is still ultimately in control. And we can get distracted, and it's easy to watch all this different media and such and lose track of time. And what's really important is, regardless of what's going on in the world, are you preparing for the Lord's return? And that's what he wants us to see in this parable. So listen, when it comes down to it, the lack of foresight is inexcusable. On that day, ignorance will not be a defense that we can give before the Lord. The point of the whole parable, the main command in this parable is be prepared. Be alert. Be ready. It's nothing to do with staying awake, because all 10 bridesmaids fell asleep that night in verse 5. Sleeping wasn't the issue. The issue was whether or not they were prepared by having the right amount of oil. If you look up in chapter 24, as far as right before this section, Jesus said it this way in chapter 24, verse 42. Be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. And then in verse 44 of chapter 24, for this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think that he will come. No one knows when the Lord or the Son of Man, the bridegroom, is going to return. But we must be ready when he comes. So as a Christian, we need to invest our time, our life, in the preparation for eternity, the preparation of the Lord's coming. So is that you? Is that how you're using your time? Question. Are you ready for the Lord to come? Are you prepared to meet the bridegroom, Jesus Christ? It's never too soon for us to prepare to meet the Maker, because we never know when it will be too late. Peter put it this way in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will burn up. Have you ever stopped and thought about that? The day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will burn up. How do you prepare for a thief? Well, you certainly can't, can you? There's no app that we can put on our phone. There's no that way that we can prepare for it except to know that it is coming, that the day of the Lord will come, and we must be prepared. It's time for all of us to acquire the oil for our lamps. Amen. The issue is now when we need to settle, what is our relationship like with Jesus Christ? What is your relationship like with Jesus Christ tonight? What is your relationship like with Jesus Christ tonight? What is your relationship like with Jesus Christ tonight? What is your relationship like with Jesus Christ tonight? Are you prepared? Your lamp must be filled with heavenly oil, and it must be burning brightly, or else you'll not be ready. And instead of walking or living in the light, you will live in the darkness. You must be brought out of the darkness and into God's light so that you will be ready. Jesus told us this parable so that we would be prepared. And again, Jesus himself said it best in Matthew chapter 24, verse 44. For this reason you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you don't think that he will. So, question that we want to end tonight. Are you ready? Are you ready for the Lord to come? If we can help you in any way, come while we sing the song of invitation.